Okay, we are live.
There's a real wrong and a real right.
I think everyone does know that God existed, assuming you do.
Simply because they don't want.
I think the answer is actually kind of already in the question there.
Many voices, one message.
We are the Mentionables.
Hello and welcome to the show that puts the odd in podcast, The Mentionables. I'm Joel Furchess.
I'm Marc Lambert.
I'm Caleb Johnston.
And I'm Clinton Wilcox.
Today on The Mentionables, we play a game of hide and seek, and we talk the out of the subject of cuss words. So I have a pretty sweet redacted button on my sound editing program, and I've always wanted an excuse to use it. Well, Caleb has unknowingly given me the excuse I've been looking for because of his topic. So I think I'm going to sprinkle in some redactions throughout this episode, especially on Marc, whose Baptist minister sensibilities run so deep that he even avoids using asterisks in social media to even imply a curse word. For the listeners at home, no actual curse words were used in this episode, but I'm going to just press the out of the redacted button. Our game today is Love Song, Worship Song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
Which I was pleased to see Caleb drop an allusion to in one of his recent posts. Caleb, were you actually thinking of this game when you wrote that, or have I just subtly influenced your vocabulary?
No, that was absolutely what I was thinking of. It in the particular article that I dropped on social media, it was discussing contemporary worship songs compared to hymns, and the theological lack of depth in a lot of current tunes. So Love Song, Worship Song was a nice nod there to it, because I think that we definitely see some of that. And again, we've covered it before, but that's kind of the reason we play this game is to kind of point out that there isn't depth on some of these. Now, that's not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but in general, we can get a lot more theological in hymns or maybe even some other genres of music at times.
That's interesting. All right, Clinton. Caleb just said that hymns contain more meaty substance than worship songs. What are your feelings on that?
Well, my feeling on that is that essentially there are good and bad songs written in every era. And so there were bad hymns that were written, but the good ones are the ones that stand the test of time. And so we shouldn't just dismiss all contemporary songs as being theologically shallow. Certainly a good number of them are, but the ones that are not theologically shallow and the ones that are less musically interesting than certain other contemporary songs will, just like the hymns, stand the test of time. So that's basically my thought, is that, you know, I love music of all stripes, and you know, the contemporary music you hear on the radio is really not much different than the contemporary pop music that you hear on pop radio stations. And don't listen to that music either because of its shallowness. And most of that music just all sounds the same. I prefer to listen to classic rock and progressive bands because they tend to be more musically complex. So it's just, you have to really know where to look to find the good songs, and you won't find them on Christian radio. You have to dig a little bit deeper to find the good ones. And I will maintain that there are a number of good contemporary songwriters, just like there were a number of good hymn writers, and there are a lot of poor contemporary songwriters, just like there were a lot of poor hymn writers. And so we just need the time to see which ones will stand that test.
I completely agree with that, Clinton. And most of my favorite Christian music these days is actually in the metal genre. So
why is that not surprising to me at all?
Have you heard of Theocracy?
Yes, very good band.
Yes, I'm very much into that group.
They're really good.
Yeah.
All right, listeners, you just got a solid recommendation from two of the mentionables. Guess we'll check that out. Well, speaking of poor lyrics, let's get into our love song, worship song. Your first lyrics. Ready?
Ready.
Okay. Pictures of you race across my mind, filling all the spaces there is to find. Melting love's own ice that lay so frozen. I give that sacrifice for feeling chosen. Hope springs eternal through your eyes, draws me closer to your side, and keeps me there where I belong, giving back the trust that was so fleeting, captured by one my heart was seeking. Okay, and those are the lyrics.
I'm going to go with love song. And even if you say worship song, you're wrong. That was totally a love song.
Well, at least nobody jumped forward and said, "I know that song."
I'm trying to think if I know it. I want to say it's a song by The Cure, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm going to say love song, but I'm totally not confident in that answer.
All right, Caleb, love song?
Just to go against the grain, I'm going worship song here.
Okay, we've got two love song and one worship song. The song was Hope Springs Eternal by Air Supply.
Oh, okay.
That would be a love song. All right.
Right kind, wrong band.
Yep. Our second lyrics as follows. You make it easy to love you. You are good and you are kind. You bring joy into my life. You make it easy to trust you. You have never left my side. You've been faithful every time. All I want is you. And that's the end of the lyrics. Love song or worship song?
I'm going to say worship song, but again, not confident.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going worship song.
All right, Caleb, worship song?
I just want to buck the system today. I'm going love song.
Okay. You got two worship song, a wood love song. The song was Follow You Anywhere by Kristen Stanfill.
I could sing of your love forever.
So for the players at home, that would be a worship song. Okay. Our final lyrics are as follows. Draw me close to you. Never let me go. I lay it all down again to hear you say that I'm your friend. You are my desire. No one else will do. 'Cause nothing else can take your place. To feel the warmth of your embrace. Help me find the way. Bring me back to you. You're all I want. You're all I've ever needed. You're all I want. Help me know you are near. Okay, those are your lyrics.
I'm going to jump right in here and go with worship song.
Okay, we've got one worship song.
Yeah, I'm going worship song.
All right, Clinton, worship song?
I do know this song, and
Okay.
I could even tell you who wrote it because we actually do this song in my church.
Okay, then
It's a worship song.
Okay, that was by who?
A number of Christian artists have played that song. The one I'm most familiar with is the Katinas, but it was written by a woman named Kelly Carpenter, I believe.
I could sing of your love forever.
Okay, so we everybody got that one, and that's the end of our love song, worship song for today. Good job, everyone, except for Caleb.
Thanks.
Isn't Caleb supposed to be defending his title on that game?
I think somebody might be ahead of him at this point. I don't know.
No, I don't think so yet. I had a lot of flawless rounds there for a while, so it's going to take a lot of catching up.
All right.
Okay. All right, let's talk 4-letter words. Caleb?
All right. So, kind of in diving into this topic, what we're discussing tonight is cursing. So, or to be a little more precise in my language, let's start off by discussing cussing. So, before kind of diving in, and without getting into the scriptures just yet on this, what are your personal thoughts or feelings on cussing?
Why don't you lead us off there, Mark?
Well, it's an odd thing because when it comes to like foul language, profanity, there is an issue to where it is socially derived. I mean, language is created and cultures shift. Things that are considered brash and crude in one setting or one circle of society isn't in another. I really think it all just kind of comes back to. And I know you're going to get into the actual passages, but I think it's in Ephesians where it says, to just let your speech be wholesome and don't, cause someone to stumble. And so, I mean, I think it just boils down to that we need to have our speech filled with grace and not crude or profane things, however that happens to be defined in our setting and culture.
Okay.
Err on the side of love and blessing.
All right, well, I'll follow up on that. I, as we know by now from many, many discussions, grew up in a pretty restrictive Christian environment. I don't want to say that because I didn't find it restrictive, but it was very conservative, let's call it. And so, of course, you didn't want to curse. That was not something that was looked well upon, and we were taught not to. In fact, we were taught not to so much that it was really frowned upon to say things like heck and darn, because too close to a cuss word. And of course you couldn't say crap, because that was a cuss word. But so I entered the larger world. I remember going to college, and everyone noticed that I didn't cuss at all, and so they made it their mission in life to get me to. I think at one point they actually offered to pay me to say some bad words. But yeah, that didn't happen. And then, entering the adult working world, the same thing has been true. People notice that, I just don't tend to use that kind of language, and it surprises them. And I think it makes them uncomfortable because they bring it up around me a lot. But I honestly, it doesn't bother me when other people do it. Some of my best friends cuss like sailors, and that doesn't bother me. I don't judge them because of it. I just let it roll. But it's not something I would do for several reasons. It's not professional. It could, in fact, offend some people. And, I move in Christian circles as well, and it's kind of frowned upon there. And, it's something I can get by in life without doing. So why do it?
That's fair. How about you, Clinton?
Yeah, well, like Mark, I actually grew up Southern Baptist, but I'm actually Lutheran now, which means that not only is the occasional cuss word permissible, but I can actually drink now. So, I almost never use any sort of words that might be considered profane. I never use any of the more coarse ones, the F word, S word, those kinds of things. I've softened a little bit on a couple of the milder ones, whereas I don't usually use it, but if I feel like I might need to emphasize something, I might use it in a way that's not crass, but still using the word, like using the word damned instead of condemned or something like that, if I feel a stronger emphasis is needed. So even though I'm Lutheran now, I still hold some Baptist sensibilities. I still agree with the verse that Mark brought up, that we should always let our speech be wholesome. I unfortunately am not always great at that because of my background. I was tormented a lot as a kid, and that sometimes comes out where I can, if someone speaks in a way that's sarcastic to me now, I have a tendency to respond in kind. So I'm still, working on that myself, even though I don't swear myself. So I do agree that we should always let our speech be wholesome and always be used for edifying. And like Joel was saying, if our speech is going to offend other believers, well, Paul wrote about that if our eating meat is going to offend somebody, we shouldn't eat meat around them, and so we shouldn't use that kind of language. And so even from a non-religious perspective, I was always told by my English teachers in school growing up that swearing is a sign of ignorance. Intelligent people don't need to swear because there's a whole host of words that you could use instead of the swear word. And so that's always stuck with me too, that I believe in constantly bettering myself and in constantly learning as much as I can. And so I just have never needed any profanities because I have a fairly wide vocabulary where I can just use words that convey the same meaning, but are not seen as crass. So, yeah, that's kind of my feelings on it. I do have friends who swear. My dad swears all the time, and I'm around him fairly often. So, it still is kind of grating on me to hear someone use language, but it's something that I can kind of let roll off my shoulders. I don't make a big thing out of it.
Yeah, what's interesting to me, because I was thinking, y'all all probably have this image of me like squeaky clean or whatever. Yeah, my roots are, redneck, blue collar. So as a kid, my parents were construction workers and baseball players. Shooting pool and throwing darts. I spent as much time at, ballparks and in bars and pool halls as I did anywhere else as a kid. And then as an adult, taking all kinds of just different construction and blue-collar jobs, profanity just, it almost doesn't even really register to me whenever people are using it around me, because it's just the language of people that I've been around. I find one thing that's odd, Joel, you're talking about like stand-in words, and I think that whenever people, are saying, no, you can't even use words like that, they take out a lot of the fun, because it's actually quite amusing to try to come up with just as off-the-wall, goofy fill-in words as you possibly can, just to shock people with your fill-in word, as it is, anything else. But
like shut the front door?
Yeah, there you go.
So that kind of raises another question I think we should touch on before kind of diving in, and we're really going to look heavily at some scripture on this. So is offending someone always wrong?
I suppose it depends on the aim of the offense.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's always wrong. I mean, I'm a pro-life speaker and writer, so obviously I offend people left and right. But
mostly left,
I think
though, right?
Oh yeah, especially left, right? So obviously I don't think it's always wrong to offend someone. I just think it's wrong to needlessly offend someone. Because if I'm going to, for example, if I'm going to talk to someone and tell them that, that they shouldn't be, having sex unless they're married, or they shouldn't kill their unborn child or something like that. That's offensive to non-pro-life sensibilities. But I'm not going to then swear at them or insult them or anything like that, because that would add offense where I'm already saying something offensive. I don't want to add any more offense to that than I absolutely need to. So I think it's more along the lines of we shouldn't needlessly offend, but there are times at which offending people is not only a necessity, but I would say a moral obligation.
Yeah, I think from your perspective, or where you're coming from, that if you're the one who comes away from that discussion having been more gracious and less offensive, and more, for lack of a better word, professional in the discussion, that it lends some credence to your side of the aisle.
Yeah, there's that too, because if you get mad, you've just lost the argument. So you always want to make sure you keep a cool head when you're having these discussions. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons why I'm a conservative, not just because I'm a Christian and because I think conservative views are correct, but whenever I try to ask someone who leans left to explain their point of view, especially on things like same-sex marriage, they can never give me an argument. It's always name-calling and that kind of thing. And so I was actually on the fence about whether or not we should allow same-sex marriage, even though I think it's wrong and it's not really marriage. I was kind of on the fence about whether or not we ought to allow it. But the fact that no one on the left could ever give me an argument for their position, and conservatives were giving arguments for their position, that pushed me over into the conservative camp that we shouldn't legalize it.
Well, that's a discussion for another time, but...
Right, yeah, I wasn't intending to get into that discussion, just illustrating that it was actually the ones making the arguments that caused me to make up my mind on a controversial issue.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think that I think we have lots of things like that. And for me personally, I think that offense can be a powerful tool in many situations. We see it with what we would consider shock art. I think people can be offended in some of those situations, and it pushes to a higher understanding of circumstances. I think, there's certainly that question. Speaking of pro-life situations, I think there's certainly a case to be made in some situations for exposing someone to pictures that are very disturbing of what an actual abortion is like. Now, I don't necessarily agree that having it out in public as merely an attempt to shock is one thing, but in proper context and used in the right kind of conversation with somebody, it could be powerful. And so what I want to do with this conversation, I want to take us and take a look at Scripture a little bit. Let's look at some things that are a little bit more shocking context-wise and somewhat offensive. And we're going to discuss context here, and I encourage all the listeners to go out, read these passages on their own, read the full context, and you can make sure I'm not taking anything out of context here, because that's the last thing we want to do with this. And once we kind of look at it from one angle, we're actually going to swing back and look at it from a different one. So in Philippians 3:8, we have Paul talking, and he's discussing his belief in Christ. And he says, "More than that, I now regard all things as liabilities compared to the far greater value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whom I suffered the loss of all things. Indeed, I regard them as dung, that I may gain Christ." Now, is anybody familiar with this passage and the particular word used here?
I don't know the word. I've heard the passage.
The word for dung there?
Yes, Mark.
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, that word would not be allowed in a Baptist church. Let's just say Paul would get in trouble for preaching this message in your typical Baptist church.
Yeah, that's pretty much on point. And while some scholars will disagree on certain aspects of it because we're again looking at a language study and history, the Greek word scubula, as best as I can pronounce it anyway, is one that is used in quite a bit of graffiti. There are more polite terms that could be used there in place, such as medical terminology, or even something that would maybe lean more towards the garbage side of things. And while this word does have multiple meanings, it appears fairly clear from his passage here that this is a pretty strong word. It's something akin to crap, or even what we would regard as the next one higher up. So, a pretty strong language Paul is using here, and he's comparing his life as a Pharisee to his life now, and he's saying that all these great things he did as a Pharisee, he regards them as crap now. That's a pretty strong statement that was probably pretty shocking for the Philippians. Now, that's just one example here. If we go back and dig into the Old Testament a little bit, we can get something that's a little bit more shocking. And I think this kind of falls in the category of what we would look at today almost as shock art, because it was God giving a prophet a message that was very much intended to shock and disgust the people of Israel when they hear it. So this one you might have to throw in some redacts. Let me throw this out there to any listeners with children in the room at the time. They may want to, go ahead for this whole segment and just fast forward till another time, because there is some strong language here. So in Ezekiel 23, 18, starting in verse 18, "When she carried on her whoring so openly and flaunted her nakedness, I turned in disgust from her, as I had turned in disgust from her sister. Yet she increased her whoring, remembering the days of her youth, when she played the whore in the land of Egypt and lusted after her lovers there, whose members were like those of donkeys, and whose issues were like that of horses. Thus she longed for the lewdness of your youth, when the Egyptians handled your bosom and pressed your young breast." So this is a pretty strong passage here that talks about members of donkeys and emissions of horses. This is pretty strong. And again, this is intended to disgust and shock people, because this, in referencing this whoredom here, it's largely about how Israel has treated God in terms of turning away to other gods and idolatry. So again, the purpose here is very much to shock and disgust and bring attention to something, and just how wicked it is when it was something that was becoming normalized in culture. And we're going to dive back to the New Testament for the last one we're going to take a look at here. And this is in Acts 23:4, where Paul is talking with a lot of the religious leaders, the Pharisees. Then Paul said to him, "God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you setting to judge me according to the law, and yet contrary to the law you order me to be struck?" So we see Paul actually cursing this religious official and calling him what is actually a rather crude name that doesn't quite come over in our terminology today. This was something I learned in researching for this episode, because I had no idea about this particular term. But a whitewash wall, typically in a house in those days, you would have one wall that was designated as the pee wall. So everybody's going to go there and pee. And one of the ways that they would clean this wall was with lime, to help sanitize and desensitize it, so it wouldn't smell so awful. And with this lime treatment, what you would end up with is essentially a whitewashed wall in your house or in the town where everybody goes to urinate. So this is actually a really offensive statement here that he is throwing at them, that is very much saying, you are the piss wall, and God's going to judge you for it. That's pretty. All this is pretty strong language, to put it kind of mildly. Now, after kind of hearing those verses and a little bit of the context, and I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with this in some way, shape, or form previously, are there any immediate thoughts that come to mind, or anything that kind of grabs you there and maybe springs to mind something you hadn't thought of before, or maybe something you have thought on before that you'd like to bring up now?
Well, I think if these passages were translated a lot more accurately, it might make church services quite different when we get to those passages.
That's very true.
Well, I don't think that you have the same measure of social taboo in that day and time as you do now. I mean, I think that in that culture, the thing you wanted to avoid in terms of what we would call cuss words is anything related to God's name. They were so sensitive about that. They wouldn't pronounce his name. They wouldn't spell out his name. They wanted to do anything they could. So that's the only equivalent that they had back then of cursing. I doubt that the piss wall or, the whoring or any of those things were taboo. They were just stronger references to, unsavory things.
One thing that comes to mind is the idea that, you often hear that this was an honor-shame culture. And in each one of these instances, the strong language is being directed in such a way as to shame a certain thing or a certain person or a certain practice. So you have Paul using the extreme language to, show the shame and dishonor of, his past and how that doesn't matter to him. It's Christ that is for honor. You have Israel being shamed for their idolatry. You have the religious leaders being shamed for, their false teachings. And so I wonder how much that might actually play into the use of this, because that it would be a shaming thing.
That's a really keen observation, Mark. I think that's probably very much on point in terms of what we're seeing here, and I think we absolutely have to look at that cultural context. I think that's a fantastic point I hadn't considered up until this point. I think it's a great point, though, and I think it does relate to some of what I was intending to talk about here, in that we have to look at language culturally. And so, as you mentioned there, we see this shame culture play out. In today's culture, it's significantly different than it was then, but we do certainly where I think the principles at play here would apply for using strong language. But I think that the biblical picture of strong language, as we would kind of look at it today, versus cursing is very different. We see cursing in quite a different light, and in the Old Testament, in that it's portrayed as being very wrong to curse someone. But they also had a extremely supernatural worldview where these curses are something beyond just calling someone a name. And like you said, it's the shame that comes with it as well that make kind of take it to that next level. But I think we as Christians are actually called to a much higher standard. So maybe I've thrown people a bone up to this point. Maybe our listeners are thinking, oh, great, I can now use those words that I thought I couldn't use anymore. But I think we're actually called to a much higher standard. Now, does that standard include the possible use of strong language in proving a point, or maybe even shocking someone to portray the right message? I think absolutely that is a possibility. And in my speech, I try to only use that kind of language in a way when it is meant to prove a point that other language would not serve. I think that there was actually a recent worship song by, I believe it was King's Kaleidoscope a couple years ago, called A Prayer. And this song gained a lot of notoriety because it used the F word in it when talking about fear being so effing violent. And it's a song about depression and depths of pain that are absolutely destructive on you. And then the song transitions to this beautiful message of God being right there with you through it. And I know that in some of my darkest moments, I've said prayers that have included a lot of profanity in terms of what I am speaking from my heart. But I know that, still the Lord has been there listening to me even in my roughest moments. And so that's just a few thoughts. But to bring this back and catch the other flip side of this coin before we close out this conversation, again, I think we're called to a much higher standard. So just as Jesus talks about adultery and says that anyone who's even looked on a woman in lust has committed adultery in his heart, I think we see the same kind of portrayal of language in the Bible. So, like Mark mentioned earlier, in Ephesians, Paul says, "Let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving." Again, he's talking about out-of-place language that's just not necessary and inappropriate here. In Colossians 4:6, we see, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer a person." Of course, Proverbs has lots to say about language. "Put away from you crooked speech, and what devious talk, and put devious talk far from you." Just a couple more. In Exodus 20, verse 7, of course, in the Ten Commandments, as Joel kind of pointed out here, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, which was certainly a major thing at the time, and I think it still should be major for us today, in that we should not use the Lord's name in a light manner, or even things are so blasphemous these days in people's talk that that's something that should never cross our lips. And then James 3:10, "From the same mouth come blessing and cursing. My brothers, these things ought not to be so." And Matthew 15:11, "It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a person." So I think when we look at the totality of Scripture, and we've just barely touched on, almost a dozen verses here that touch on this subject of language. But when we review it in its entirety, I think we get this picture that we can adapt to our current culture that indicates that, language is much less about the words used to convey that meaning than taking every single word we use captive and using it in a way that's glorifying to God. Whether that be something that's a little bit shocking or whether that be something that is of uttermost thanksgiving, we have to use every word captive. So that idle tongue that spits off a sarcastic remark at your spouse after you've disagreed with them may be significantly harsher judged than that curse word you let fly at some point or another. And I think that Matthew 12:36 lays this out. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. So we're not just called to avoid curse words or cussing as we think of it today. We are called to give an account for every careless word we speak. Much like with Jesus' statements, I think this is a much more challenging standard to hold up to that points to our need for a Savior, because it's not just what we think of as bad language. It goes far beyond that. Any other thoughts or things that have came to mind while we're talking about this before I kind of close us out on this topic?
I've got quite a bit I was thinking about.
Yeah, dive in, Joel. Hit us with it.
All right. Well, I'll start from the neurological or psychology end, unless you were going to get into that.
Nope, you go right ahead.
All right. So for whatever reason, because of the importance of language, I suppose, in our brain structure, there's actually a portion of your brain that, if stimulated, it pours out all the cuss words. In other words, for whatever reason, offensive language is compartmentalized to a very specific speech section of your brain, which is, it says a lot about how we view offensive language, because we compartmentalize it to a section of the brain. There's a physiological aspect to curse words because we put a certain value on them as human beings. And that's why you see Tourette's syndrome. That's essentially a seizure that's occurring in the language center of your brain that's causing you to spit out all these words that would otherwise be considered offensive. Now, having said that, studies will show that the use of a curse word actually has a physiological release. It releases certain, I don't know if it's endorphins, certain hormones in the brain that bring some sort of physical relief when you're under sort of pressure or anger or anything, so that the actual use of the cuss word actually brings some kind of mental health to it, which is why we create these substitute words, so that we're not using vernacular that is broadly recognized as offensive, but we still get that physiological relief when we say heck or darn, anything. That's why we have to create words to say in those moments, regardless of what they are. Our body needs that physiological release by stimulating that language center of our brain for some reason. So there's that. And then, we're talking about the Jewish culture put a lot of value upon words. In that culture, words were power. And so when you cursed someone, that, you were essentially calling down some kind of misfortune upon them. And if you were a devout Jew, you were essentially talking to God in kind of an imprecatory way to that person, which is why, it was so bad to do it, because you were bringing God into the equation when you were angry at the person. So there's that. Those are the major things that came to mind.
I think those are great points to bring up, and I think it's interesting to consider the psychology that we see play out with the use of language in our culture. I think it would be really fascinating if we could have a comparison, especially, with another time period, and see if the same kind of physiological reaction would exist in that time frame as it does now. And I'm honestly not sure whether some of that is a development based on the culture we've come to recognize over the last 50 years here in America compared to cultures in other countries, which may have a different linguistical structure in some of these ways. But that's certainly
South
interesting.
And Central America in that, because my wife's from Brazil, and so she's pretty familiar with the cultures in that area. And yeah, everybody's got cuss words. Countries all over the world, there are certain words that are are recognized as profane.
Interesting.
It's just who we are as people and human beings. For some reason, we need to create those words.
Very interesting. Any other thoughts, or anybody want to bounce back on Joel on that?
Not specifically on what Joel had mentioned, but something that occurred to me, kind of a little more pastoral, practical, Christian living sort of idea. The fact is that a lot of these words are culturally defined, right? There's things that are considered curse words now that didn't used to be, or things that used to be considered cuss words that now nobody cares. If I'm down at the local watering hole, visiting somebody, I could, drop an S word or an A word. No one's going to bat an eye, won't even register, but if you're in Sunday school, then it's a scandal. And one thing that's easy for people to do is to think, oh, well, it's not really a bad thing if I do it this time. Like you stub your toe, you say ouch, or you say the S word. What's the big deal? But I think there's an issue where when you control the little things, it creates the discipline to be able to control the big things. And I think that there's an element of that I think we need to understand. You're talking about we're being held, we're held to a higher standard, and I think part of that is it. That we're not willy-nilly about even the small things. Partially because I think that it's in the small things, having the victories over the things that really don't matter, actually is the practice and discipline that helps you to be able to have the victory in the times when it really does.
I think that's a great point as well, Mark, and I think you're on track there. And maybe that speaks some to the psychology of it, in that while there may be this psychological response to uttering a cuss word, the resistance of that is something that is universal in terms of how we look at psychology and how we build up a resistance to certain addictive behaviors. I've seen cussing become very addictive for some people, in that it's become part of their regular vocabulary, and I'm sure that when they get that endorphin response, it becomes very addictive in that sense. So again, even mastering something such as the words that are coming out of your mouth has a power over, what you were learning and how you were learning to control the rest of your behaviors. So I think that's a good point as well.
That brings up the other point that I was thinking of, Caleb, that I forgot, and that is that you see this happen. I've been very vocal about the research that I'm doing now. So you see this happen when people move from a more restrictive, or for lack of a better word, conservative environment to in the other direction of the spectrum, is that for some reason their use of profanity just gets more and more extreme, until it just becomes such an integral part of who they are in their vocabulary. And it's just, I think it has to do with this idea of these restrictions are raised on me now. I am no longer have to behave and be a good girl or a good boy, and because I don't have to do that, I'm going to jump right in and do all those things that I've never been able to do before.
Very, very interesting. That's something else worth consideration, that's for sure. Well, to close out this segment, again, my overall take on the scriptures, and again, I think every believer has to judge this for themselves, is that there may be times where we are called to use strong language or a strong example in a certain sense, but you have to first take every word seriously that you say, in that it's a mastery of the tongue in a way that goes far beyond just avoiding certain words. It's avoiding any talk that's a put down, especially to non-believers. In a lot of these examples here, we're looking at, Paul's cursing is actually towards the believers in Acts 23, or the claimed religious leaders of the day. So, again, these are certainly not insults he would put forth to a non-believer. So, again, it's a lot of personal judgment that has to go into this, and I think a lot of scripture reading to really get a solid picture on what is intended by the scriptures. And I think Proverbs is a good place to start. Proverbs 10:32 gives us the lips of the righteous know what is acceptable, but the mouth of the wicked what is perverse. And I think that sums up pretty much everything we've talked about in this segment tonight, from what words should be used all the way to the deconversion and how language changes after that. So I think, as usual, Proverbs hits the nail on the head and sums it up for us.
All right. Well, thank you, Caleb.
Yep.
I'll go ahead and start us off on the next topic. So my topic today is the subject of divine hiddenness. The topic was inspired by you, Clinton. You mentioned this was a solid atheist argument in a previous episode. Care to revisit that?
Okay, yeah. Calling it a solid atheist argument might need a little unpacking. I don't think it's a sound argument. I think it's a compelling argument. But ultimately, I think Christianity provides a good response to the problem of divine hiddenness. Tyler Vela isn't on the podcast, but I know he doesn't even think that it's a valid question. I disagree with him on that. But yeah, I think more the problem of evil. We know the logical problem of evil it has been solved by Alvin Plantinga, but there's the evidential problem of evil, which again I don't think is a great argument, but I think it's emotionally compelling. And divine hiddenness, I think, is probably a stronger argument, even though I don't think it's necessarily logically sound. I think it's at least emotionally compelling, because I understand, the desire to say, well, if God is there, why doesn't he communicate with us? Because, I can communicate with a whole bunch of people, my friends and family. If I expect God to be my father, why doesn't he ever communicate with me like my own father does? And, those kinds of things. So I can understand why someone might consider divine hiddenness to be a compelling point in favor of atheism. But some of the Christian thinkers that I've read, I think, have provided good responses to divine hiddenness. And so I think I still believe in God, because I believe, number one, I believe I've had experiences of God in the past, but also because that the arguments for God's existence are numerous and are sound arguments. And I think that Christianity has good responses to the best arguments that atheists can level toward Christians.
Yeah, so as an argument from atheists about God, there's like you said, there's a method or a way in which that's compelling, but in another sense, it's also a question that Christians have, right? Or at least I talk to Christians that say that it sounds like they're talking to the ceiling, feels like they're talking to the ceiling, that why don't I feel my faith? Why don't I feel the presence of God? And so on and so forth. So this idea of divine hiddenness can be approached from both directions, from the atheist direction where, they're like, if God really wanted me to believe in him, he know what would convince me, and he hasn't done that, so clearly he doesn't exist. I think that's a bit of a leap to take, but I understand their point.
Yeah.
But, on the other end, for Christians, I completely understand how that is a difficulty, because I can show with fairly convincing evidence that there's a good chance that God does exist and that his character and nature is XYZ, but all of those evidences don't get us over the hump of, I'm going through a problem right now, why doesn't God visit me in this difficulty? So, yeah, in that sense, it's compelling because it hits you from both angles.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, because as a Christian myself, I still, I have times like that too, and I wonder, I'm saved now. God doesn't need to keep himself hidden from me because I don't, I've already come to him willingly. So why, why doesn't God make himself more known in my life? And so I still struggle with that too as a believer. And so that's why I find it a compelling argument, even if it's not logically compelling, it's emotionally compelling at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'd like to talk about that after I've gone over come at it from the atheist end, if I can remember to revisit that. Now, you mentioned that, you've seen solid answers to that. Honestly, I haven't looked into it that much. I've heard soundbite answers. And the soundbite answer I always hear is that, well, if God came in and made his existence super obvious to us, that we would be forced against our free will to accept him. Have you ever heard that argument?
I have. I think that argument, a lot of times I've seen it, has been attributed to C.S. Lewis. I'm not sure where he said that, if it was in Mere Christianity or somewhere else. I've read about half of what C.S. Lewis has ever written, and I don't remember that, but it's been a while since I've read a lot of his books, so it might be in there somewhere. But I usually see it attributed to him, and I find that a fairly compelling point. I know it can be devolved or relegated into the category of a soundbite, but I think that that's not the strongest response I've ever heard, but I think it's at least one worth considering.
What about you other gentlemen? What do you think about that particular argument?
Yeah, I think it's fairly compelling, at least from a standpoint of when we're looking at divine hiddenness merely as this kind of, again, meme or soundbite idea. Then I think this response is one that will at least provoke further thought in that area. And it's always been an answer that has been fairly sufficient for me personally in terms of my understanding of the nature of God and our relationship to him, is that a complete revelation of his presence would be very much overpowering. So it's been a compelling answer for me.
Okay.
I think for me it kind of rates as one of those, well, that's possible, sounds plausible. I mean, that could be the case in some instances. So I personally don't find the divine hiddenness all that compelling, or not sound. I don't know. God plays hide and seek like a 4-year-old, so I don't really understand the hiddenness, but...
All right, so as far as so he doesn't undermine our free will argument, I try to put on my skeptic helmet when I hear these things first, and that would be something I find pretty easy to dismiss as a skeptic. I mean, you can see instances in even the Bible where people were perfectly aware of God. They were looking him in their face, and they still rejected him. So it seems at least plausible that somebody could be aware of God's existence and not accept him and not have their free will violated in the process. So I'd have to hear the argument out as presented by someone rather than just characterizing it as a soundbite before I dismiss it, but from the soundbite end, it just doesn't work for me.
Yeah, that's why I usually reject soundbites, because they're usually pretty useless. Any soundbite can be rejected if you don't go into detail about why that particular position works, and so that's why I tend to reject things like soundbites and slogans.
Yep. Unfortunately, skeptic argument tends to be in the form of a soundbite, and if you can't give them a soundbite answer, they easily dismiss you. But oh well.
Yeah, that's true. But then you have, there's a quote I heard. I don't remember who wrote it. Something like, an atheist can dismiss in one sentence when it takes a theist, 3 paragraphs to respond or several pages to respond. And then the atheist will go on and use that same sentence later on as if his argument had never been responded to or something like that. And so that's just, I think, kind of an example of how people in our culture just don't know how to argue and don't know how to reason very well, because they're not willing to consider arguments any more deeper than at the soundbite level. And if you can't give them a soundbite response, they tune you out. And I think that's to the detriment of the people doing the arguing. I don't consider that a benefit in any way. And so, yeah, I don't know what to tell an atheist who wouldn't listen to me because I want to give them too lengthy a response. Well, sometimes, I can't make a coherent argument in just 1 or 2 sentences.
That's true. All right, so again, I haven't studied the other arguments, but I have my own. I argue that God isn't all that hidden. And there are 3 specific ways in which I think God's existence is pretty obvious. All right, so the first is something I've spoken about before, and it's this intuitive awareness of God. So when a person raises the objection of divine hiddenness, what are they saying? They're saying that God doesn't reveal himself. That's interesting. Who doesn't reveal himself? God. What God? So at this point, most atheists that I've talked to will sort of retreat to the, how should I know what God is? You're the one talking about him. I have no knowledge or beliefs regarding God. That's interesting. Then how do you know he's hidden himself if you don't even know what he is?
Right, that's a belief about God.
Yeah. Well, it's because I don't know what he is. So what you're telling me is that if you had knowledge enough to define God so that you knew what you were talking about, he would not be hidden, and this wouldn't be a problem. So essentially this idea that one cannot have knowledge or beliefs regarding God dissolves into absurdity. I mean, name a single other imaginary construct that you couldn't have any knowledge about.
Right.
I could know all about fairies or dragons or unicorns without believing in them. I could study their history and cultural development and fiction and so forth. But for some reason, you make an exception when it comes to God. The very notion that God belongs in a different category of knowledge or belief than any other fictional thing is kind of fascinating to me. If God is made up, why make this category exception for him over any of the other concepts on Earth? It seems tremendously suspicious to me.
Yeah, I mean, atheists will often say that belief in God is no different than belief in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. And, well, I have beliefs about Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. So, yeah, that is kind of weird that they would have no beliefs about God, like you're saying.
Yeah. So, I mean, a response to this might be that it's because the idea of God is different for every person. I have no notion of God, so how am I supposed to tell what you're talking about when you say God? Now that right there is an admission that I have knowledge of God, which is fascinating as I come to my next point. I've spoken about this before, so I won't get all of the research surrounding it. But when it comes down to the core, we've shown this that via experimentation, as young as we can measure, children have a concept of unseen agency. They naturally assume that things around them happen for a reason and are guided by some kind of fundamental intelligence. Further even, they believe that everything around them exists for some kind of intentional purpose. So early in life, kids are less curious about how things work and more curious about what function they serve. So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so would you say then that would, because atheists are fond of saying that atheism is the default position because you need evidence of God in order to prove God exists. You don't have to prove God doesn't exist in order not to believe. So would you say that maybe not Christianity or theism itself, but maybe a belief in some kind of higher power would actually be the default position based on how intuitive and natural it is for us to believe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is, at core, a belief of intentionality and purpose behind the world. And this can be borne out by the fact that, it would be difficult to find a single lucid individual throughout history or in any other culture that would have no idea what you're talking about when you talk about God.
Yeah, now I can kind of see the atheist point here, and this is something that I sometimes hear Christians talk about, is that even if the atheist gives you some kind of definition about God, it's usually not the kind of God that Christians worship. And so I can kind of see the atheist point in that sense, in that, if he doesn't know what your idea of God is, then he really can't respond, in a certain way that might disprove God in his mind. And so, I can kind of see his point in that sense.
So what I'm arguing here is not that we would know exactly who or what God is. What I'm arguing here is that God isn't that hidden, because we're, like you said, we're essentially born with this intuitive notion of God. And, I'll bear this out. One researcher I've talked about before on the show described children as intuitive theists. In fact, that was in the title of her thesis document that she did on her research, was Children Are Intuitive Theists. Theists. So, in my current research, I just read a paper titled The Origins of Religious Disbelief. And this is a paper by an atheist researcher, Will Gervais, from the University of Kentucky. And he writes a lot of theses and research and so forth on the subject of atheism and how it functions and its role in society and so forth. But I'm going to quote a section from this particular paper. Will says, quote, "Although there is a considerable and lively scientific debate, one widely discussed view holds that disbelief, when it arises, results from significant cognitive effort against these powerful biases. According to this view, if the mind perceiving and purpose-seeking brains of human beings effortlessly infer the existence of invisible agents with intentions, beliefs, and wishes, then disbelief lacks intuitive support. Therefore, atheism is possible, but requires some hard cognitive work to reject or override these intuitions that nourish religious belief." What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's quite the admission coming from someone who is himself an atheist.
Yeah, and a pretty ardent one as well.
Yeah, so why does he, considering that, why does he think that atheism would be the true position?
Well, of course, his argument is going to be that these intuitive God beliefs are a result of evolution. If you haven't heard these arguments before, it's this idea that kind of a pareidolia, pattern-seeking aspect of the human mind is, serves some kind of purpose in, functioning of our everyday life. So if we are sitting around doing something and we hear a loud bang behind us, our intuition is that there was some kind of intention, some kind of agency behind that bang, because that puts us on the defense and prepares us for, encountering some kind of threat. In likelihood, the bang was a door closing or something falling off a shelf or something like that. But our first intuition is there's agency behind that. And, so this evolved from caveman days where a rustle in the bushes would probably mean some kind of predator, and therefore we were best to be put on our guard to see agency and everything. And it just kind of developed into this intuition that says that there's some kind of invisible agency behind everything and that things exist for a purpose.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure how that would translate into a genetic predisposition toward that, though.
Well,
yeah, that's heavily ad hoc. You're bringing in an awful lot of extra stuff there to make that work.
Further down in the paper, Gervais's argument was that, it takes a lot of analytical thought and a lot of, intentional intelligence to overcome these primitive intuitions in our, he reframes it in a way that makes God beliefs look like, childish, the childish intuitions that they are, the imaginary friend thing, and that if you're smart and you really try hard, you can overcome these primitive intuitions. So, by the end of the paper, you're thinking, wow, theists are really stupid.
Right. So he's not exactly very friendly toward theism, even though kids are inclined in that direction. I guess he thinks theists just never grow out of it or something.
Well, I could show, again, there are these studies that show that, hey, we as a species never grow out of it. So they've sat atheist scientists down and they've run them through these tests where they have to give rapid responses to images and various questions and things. And if you force them to answer intuitively, they revert to the sense that things occur for a purpose and that there's agency behind things. That never goes away. It's just something we push down and develop defenses against. So it goes a little further then. Before I get to the next part, I'm going to have to describe something called priming. Caleb, are you familiar with priming?
Yeah, so essentially priming would be a scenario where you are preconditioned with a proposal of some kind. So you're set up in such a way that you're prepared for a certain response by much like it gets its name from the same thing we do with engines. So you have to prime the engine with gasoline if you're going to be able to get it to start. So it's very much the same way in that you have to do something in advance to get ready for that next step.
Yeah. So, we see this in kids a lot because, you sit down and make a kid watch a cowboy movie. The next thing they're going to be doing when they get up is acting like a cowboy. They want to play cowboys. Or I remember as a kid, I would sit down and watch some kind of goofy comedy, and I'd get up and I'd try to be goofy and comedic. That was just the sense that you had. Now, in adults, one of the first priming experiment that I read about when I was studying the thing was they would sit a college student down and make them do a word search. And the word search would have words like gray and Florida and bingo and cane and senile, things that primed them to think of old age. And then they would watch them get up and go down the hall, and they'd get up very gingerly, and they would kind of walk down the hall in sort of this deliberate fashion, so they were primed with these words that primed this idea of old age, and without even realizing it, what they were doing, they started to act in ways that were a little more elderly. Or another experiment I saw was they had people sit down and write as many words as they possibly could related to intelligence, like professor and diploma and brain and anything they could think of that was an intelligent word. And then they had them play Trivial Pursuit. And the students that were primed with words of intelligence actually did a little better on that game than students that weren't. So you get the idea. You put an idea in somebody's head and then they kind of act it out unintentionally. So even atheists act differently when they're primed, and this is the study they did. In studies where they have people primed with the idea of God, they tend to be more honest on testing and more generous in games where you exchange money and so forth. So, prime with the idea of God, people still behave as if there's a God. And then I brought it up before, there's actual studies that show that God beliefs are ubiquitous across the world for every culture that you can go into. At worst, you're going to have cultures that don't have God beliefs, but they still have animistic beliefs, meaning that things have some kind of consciousness or purpose to them, so they still have this idea of a spiritual realm where there's unseen forces. So, right off the bat, we're saying that God has not revealed himself to humans, and yet right from birth, everyone has some basic notion related to God. It may not be the word God and the idea of an old guy in the sky, but it's the idea of unseen agency and minds that you can't see and intention behind the world. So we have an inbuilt sense of God. And, I mean, obviously the atheist is going to say, well, that was evolution. Maybe it was. But right there would be the genetic fallacy to say that we got this through evolution, therefore it's not real.
Right. Yeah, I mean, if God exists, as I think Alvin Plantinga once argued, if God exists, then evolution might have been the process by which God reveals himself to us. He could have implanted that in us through the evolutionary process.
Right. So you can't say that God hasn't in some way indicated his presence, even if that indication was brought about through evolution. It's there. It's not there.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, you got the philosophical double negative going.
Yep, that's what I try. So my second argument I saw it first suggested by C.S. Lewis, and it's this idea that we have a desire for God, and this is essential to human nature. So, of course, the atheist will immediately jump in and reject the point that we have a desire for God. I mean, they don't desire God, right? They desire not God. Well, since I know we at least have one atheist listening to the show, I'm not saying that all atheists intentionally reject God. I'm sure there are rational reasons to believe that God doesn't exist. But at any rate, they don't care about God, and, they're not particularly upset that he doesn't exist and so forth. But then they go on and put forth the objection from evil. And that's their strongest objection against the existence of God. So what this tells me is that A, they don't like evil, and B, they believe that a real God would fix the evil if he actually existed. In even raising this objection, they're telling me that they want someone to come along and fix the evil in the world. The objection itself portrays a desire for God. Maybe not the God of the Bible, but some higher power that can solve the pain and the problems that we have. Because if their idea is that, hey, we don't need a higher power, we can solve our own problems, then what's the objection from evil? It just kind of dissolves at that point.
Right.
So then we see from studies that atheists have a natural difficulty with gratitude. Now, I'm not saying that atheists aren't grateful. They are, and that's the problem. When something good happens, atheists have a feeling of gratitude towards something outside of themselves. Now, it can't be another human being because, if you happen to win the lottery or get the promotion or whatever, and you're very grateful for that, it's not another person that's responsible for that. You're just I've actually seen atheists that I follow thank the universe for something good that happened to them. So we have this sense of gratitude, but we can't throw it out on anything. And we all have this desire for what? Something that doesn't exist? So yeah, this is a C.S. Lewisian argument. The fact that we have this desire is evidence that there exists something to fulfill the desire we have. And unlike, say, historical evidence or something that would require studying and discovering, this desire is innate to our nature. So much like the previous point I made, it seems as if God has built into us something that points to his existence, which isn't exactly hiddenness. If nothing else, it's a motivating operation to pursue God.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's a lot of counterpoints to divine hiddenness based on pure evidence, if you will, from a psychological perspective here. I mean, that's a lot of evidence.
Yeah, well, I'm not done yet.
All right.
Yeah, the argument from desire is actually, I think, one of my... I'd probably put it in my top 10 of compelling arguments for Christianity, because I think the argument from desire works. I've discussed the argument with several atheists, and none of them seemed particularly taken by it. And I think that largely stems from just not really having a good understanding of what it means to desire something, and the fact that all of our natural desires have natural fulfillments. And since all of our desires have natural fulfillments, if we have a natural desire that's innate in us that nothing in this world can satisfy, then it follows that we're made for another world, and of course that world being heaven, God's realm. And so, yeah, I find that argument to be a compelling argument too.
Yeah, it's something that I think can be brought to bear on several different arguments that I've heard, but I'm not going to list those right now.
Right.
All right, so my final argument would be the Romans 1 argument, that we can know something about God, or that we know the existence of God from creation. Now, this is not the first point I would slam down on a table in front of an atheist, because it's the one they've been working for 100 or so years to refute. So you say you can know anything about God from nature, and they're going to respond two ways. The first is that science has shown us how everything works, and that whatever we don't know about yet is just God of the gaps. You know, you can't cram God into the things we don't know, because we'll eventually know those things. Now, my very, very first point was that humans intuit design from the world around them, right? It's the very basic first conclusion we come to when we look around before we do any science at all. This must be here for a reason. So in terms of hiddenness, we have to do a lot of work before we disillusion ourselves of this notion that things have purpose and design and so forth. So in terms of hiddenness, there's a lot of hide and seek to be done before God is hidden again. We can only start to complain about divine hiddenness after we've thoroughly hidden him. The immediate objection is going to be that we can explain appearance of design when we do the work, and so in the long run it's just an illusion. To which I would respond that knowing how something works isn't the same as knowing why it works. So we can describe every mechanism existing in a pocket calculator, but once we've described its function to the nth degree, we still haven't ruled out the possibility of purpose. And the same is true of the universe. We've done a pretty thorough job of describing the forces that make the universe go, but this in no way eliminates God, unless your understanding of God was that he was at a hand crank operating the whole thing. A mechanism could be completely functional without an intelligence to keep it going. What I'm saying here is that science has done a completely adequate job of describing the universe, but it is in no way incompatible with a God. So here I want to quote an astrophysicist named Sarah Salviander. She has a fantastic Twitter feed, so if you're at all interested in astronomy, as I am, I recommend you follow her. But here she's talking about when she was starting to realize before she went from being an atheist to becoming a Christian. She says, quote, "I remember being astounded by this, blown away, completely and utterly awed. It seemed incredible to me that there was a way to find the answer to this question we had about the universe. In fact, it seems that every question we had about the universe is answerable. There's no reason it has to be this way. And it made me think of Einstein's observation that the most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it's comprehensible. I started to sense an underlying order to the universe. Without knowing it, I was awakening to the Psalm 19, which tells us so clearly, the heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the works of his hand." End quote. So at bottom, I think the objection of divine hiddenness is, in some ways, self-refuting. The very fact that we are looking for God indicates to me that we are aware of God, and, given this awareness, we're seeking him. God has made his presence pretty dang obvious, and we have to do a lot of mental gymnastics to get to the point where we say we can't see him. So what are your thoughts, gentlemen?
Yeah, I actually, you touched on the point that I find the most compelling as a response to divine hiddenness, the fact that God has revealed himself to us quite clearly in the universe, for those who have eyes to see, to use biblical language. if you're searching for God, God's existence is revealed all around us, and so I think that's probably the most compelling argument against divine hiddenness for me. And even though God doesn't speak to us in an audible voice like another human being might, there are several ways in which God does communicate to individual through circumstances in their lives, through the reading of scripture and things like that. So I think just that, that God revealed himself through his very creation, I think is probably the most compelling response for me at any rate.
Yeah, I'm what you might call an atheist. I lack a belief in atheists.
Right.
I haven't seen any evidence that I should believe that any exist. For all these reasons, and while I don't have all of the lists of details and quotations of the psychological studies and everything that have gone on, there's just so much of this that is so intuitive. It's just out there. Whenever someone tells me, why is God hidden? I think, what do you mean hidden? Right? Like I said earlier, and kind of tongue-in-cheek, God plays hide and seek like my 4-year-old does. It's not very good. If God's hiding, he's really bad at it, because all of this obviousness of God being out there. That's my thought.
Okay.
It's kind of like people in a relationship. You could demand that someone show you that they love you and prove it to you. But there is honestly nothing there that is going to be able to compel you that way, in terms of there's nothing they can ask for. They want an overwhelmingness that absolutely overwhelms every aspect of them, versus looking at the evidence for that love that's there. You can see it in your interactions. You can feel it in terms of how you talk with someone. You can see it in how they talk about you to other people. There is nothing else that could be asked for that would prove a love in many of these relationships that isn't already there in terms of what evidence actually means, short of, that person dying for you and then looking back on it and saying, oh, well, I guess they really did love me. And in the most ironic manner, we actually see that the Christian view is that God actually did that too.
Yeah. Just a brief touch on the other problem that was, what do I do if I'm a Christian and I just don't feel God's presence and he seems hidden from me? This is a very emotional question. So it's very difficult for me to just kind of jump in with statistics and, logical reasoning and disperse that difficulty. And because it's an emotional difficulty, it's something that I could only address from personal experience, and my experience isn't other people's experience. So any answer I could give to that may not be particularly satisfactory. But what I can say is that, firstly, we see this trend, which is across the board, that the more desperate a person is, the more attracted to God they are. You see this in Scripture. All of these people come to Jesus. Why? To hear his teachings? No, because they were in pain. They had illness. They had sickness. They couldn't get up and walk. So they were coming to Jesus because they were in dire straits. And, the one I'm most reminded of was the gentleman that was, on a stretcher, and he was lowered through the ceiling, and, the first words that Jesus said, your sins are forgiven. Now, had Jesus turned around and walked away at that point, that gentleman would have received the best gift he could ever get. Because I guarantee you, when Jesus healed him and he got up and walked, he didn't walk for the rest of his life. At some point, he got sick again. He got old again. He died eventually. But when he died, he had received forgiveness. It was this pain that caused him to seek. And you can look at the statistics. I'm doing a research on this because I'm about to enter a debate on it. But, you look at countries that are in dysfunctional and their poor economic situation, the worse a country is, the more religious it just happens to be. And I've got the statistics to show this. So for whatever reason, pain compels us to seek after God. Well, I can tell you that when I am in dire situations, the fact that God is not so obvious actually intrigues me. This pursuit, this active pursuit of God, is something that I really enjoy. I guess enjoy is not the right word, but it's something that gives me purpose in life, I suppose is the better way to put it. This fact that God's not in my face all the time, that I have to seek after him, I have to study, I have to learn, I have to do all of these things in constant pursuit of God. It gives purpose to my life, and it really something that makes my life worth living in a way.
Right. It really is relational. Is the best way to describe it, because it really does take on the characteristics of a relationship. And that relationship, when it is strained, takes commitment and work to benefit and grow from that.
When it comes to the issue of Christians feeling God being distant, usually one of the first things I'll do is point them to the Psalms and say, well, you're in good company. Because, David, there's several Psalms where he's crying out, God, where are you? Why are you so far away from me? But then it ends with, I know you are there, and, your salvation is sure. There's a sense, it's weird. The older you get, spend some time being married, get you some kids, and there's things that start to make a lot more sense. There's times in marriage where the closeness isn't there, but the commitment and the love still is, even though the feeling of intimacy isn't. And with children, there's times where, you've told them something, you've taught them, and now you have to back off and just let them do it. And I think that there's times where we go through things, and we're saying, God, where are you? But he's already given us his word, through the scripture. He's already given us, our brothers and sisters around us. He's already given us experience with them through life. And all we're really lacking is that emotional sense in the moment. But we have every other reason to believe and to trust and to know that he's there and what we should be doing in following after him. I heard someone, another thing to consider, heard someone one time compare it how, and I don't know, Joel, you may actually know something on this, that our minds, we're constantly bombarded with information daily, just from all over the place. But we can only reabsorb so much information. And if we're if we're not surrounding ourselves with the things of God, then we're not hearing the things of God. Right? He's just one of the voices in the storm of information flowing over us. And so I think sometimes we need to actually stop and engage and be intentional and actually seeking and listening, pushing aside the other noise in our life. Sometimes we get kind of bad at that.
I mean, it is difficult to push those things aside because that's an intentional act you have to do. You can't just kind of wait for life to quiet down for you. You actually have to come in and find a way to quiet down yourself.
Yeah. And I think a lot of times that's, especially if we are, as you said, desperate, or if we're just in a period where we're, just exhausted emotionally, we want God to just come in and do it. But there is that from our side of the relationship where we need to do our part. And sometimes it is just that we're not. God, why aren't you there? Well, he is. The problem is you're not. Sometimes that could be the case as well.
I'll tell you what, one of my favorite verses in the Bible is Proverbs 25:2, which says, "It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out." So this, one of the reasons this is such a meaningful verse to me is that it's this idea that we as human beings actually achieve some level of, what this verse is calling glory in our pursuit of knowledge, in our pursuit of philosophy and theology and all of these, and science and all of these things that God has, quote, concealed that we are seeking out and finding. It's like we're finding the Easter eggs, so to speak. And, it's this reciprocal situation where God has put these meaningful, things for us to find out there and given us the option of finding them. And, this from life, it's not really finding the things that's rewarding. It's the pursuit of the thing that's rewarding. So, I love that verse.
Yeah, that hits the nail on the head.
All right, well, it seems like we're all done with that. Before we go, I want to read a little listener mail.
You've got mail.
To which all of you are probably familiar, because, we are the Mentionables. We're a team, dang it.
Right.
This one comes from Facebook. Michael Hoover says, quote, "Every episode I keep expecting you guys to reason yourselves out of theism. You get so close, realizing what's happening, then jump way back. You'll get there eventually," smiley face. So we engaged in a little conversation with him about that, and it turns out he's referring to the last episode that Caleb and I did about behaviorism and the rule-governed behaviors. So he isn't entirely wrong here as far as the arguments go. All right, behaviorism is one of the more prevalent arguments you'll see against theism, and Christianity in particular. So as you fellows know, I just began my doctoral work on behavioral analysis, and the very first day I came into class, the professor began to talk to us about science and the use of empiricism. And as she's lecturing, she throws up on the screen a slide of all the things that scientific empiricism has helped us to discover and the things it's disproven. And under things it's disproven on the slide, she had a picture of a unicorn, the geocentric model of the solar system, and the Sistine Chapel painting of God. So she briefly says, "So we've disproven unicorns. We no longer think the sun orbits Earth," and she brushes over the picture of God and mutters, "That's controversial," and then flips to the next slide.
Well, I tell you what, if science has disproven God, that would certainly be news to all of the Christians, Muslims, Jews, etc., who practice science now and basically for the past couple thousand years.
Well, that's why it's controversial. I mean, she admitted.
Well, yeah, I kind of glanced over it.
Yeah. So the argument here is that our thoughts are just part of our behavior. A philosophy that we call radical behaviorism, which says that not just our visible behaviors, but also our private behaviors, like the things we think, which include our God beliefs, are part of this behaviorism, which, essentially it's a form of determinism. Now, first of all, I'll say that this would be a problem for Christianity if determinism isn't something that we've been, working with theologically for, hundreds of years now. We go back and forth on the subject of determinism. But, so Mike, I want to address your concern here, and in order to do that, I'm going to read a Bible passage. I know, a Bible passage as a response to a science argument. Groan, right? Well, bear with me here. This one comes from Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, quote, "For I do not understand my own actions. For I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. Now if I do what I do not want, I agree with the law that it is good. For I have the desire to do what is right, but not the ability to carry it out. For I do not do the good I want, but the evil I do not want is what I keep doing." It's a mouthful. Now, if you exclude the theological spin, I think we can all relate to Paul's internal struggle here. So, it's beginning to what I call fat season here in America. First comes Halloween, and suddenly there's lots of candy on hand. And then about the time the last candy wrapper's thrown away, we're stuffing our face with turkey and yams and pumpkin pie. And about the time the last piece of cold turkey is picked off the bone, here come Christmas with lots of candy and cookies and dinners and so forth. So between October and January, we've put on about a dozen pounds or so. I don't know about you, but the whole time I'm stuffing my face, I'm thinking, I probably shouldn't be doing this. I go on looking
pretty much.
Yeah, I go looking for leftovers and cookies and candy, and part of me is struggling to tell myself that both for my appearance and my health, I should probably not be doing those things.
I regret nothing.
Well, some people do.
I unfortunately struggle with that myself, so I know how that goes.
It's not exactly a sin, right? But it's very similar to what Paul's expressing here. What's happening is that my body is seeking what we would call a primary reinforcer. That is a fundamental physical stimulus that would appeal to my senses no matter what stage of biological development I'm in. I mean, whether it's a human or a seagull, the sweetness of sugar will always stimulate and reinforce a behavior. Now, what about my desire to resist this temptation? Well, that's the rule-governed behavior we were talking about in the previous episode. There's a portion of my mind that elevates immaterial abstracts, like my attractiveness, over the very tempting primary reinforcer of sweetness. And this is what separates humans from animals. Just like animals, we crave sex, but unlike animals, we also elevate things like loyalty and fidelity in order to remain faithful to our spouses. And sometimes we can't follow those rule-governed behaviors. It's a struggle of primary physical reinforcers against abstract, immaterial, self-reinforcing rule-governed behavior. So then there's metacognition, which is our ability to be aware of our own thoughts. Now, Caleb, last episode you talked about a woman who snapped her wrist with a rubber band every time she was having hallucinations. You remember that?
Right. Case I'd heard about many years ago.
Yeah, so essentially using punishment to train her brain to stop hallucinating. And this sort of implies that there is a part of her mind which can identify those things which are unreal from those things that are real, and then, really interestingly, some part of her is trying to override the very brain that's tricking her.
Right.
Anyway, there's a lot more I could say on that subject, but we've already done 2 segments, and I don't want to record a 3-hour podcast, so anything to add in relationship to that male, guys?
I mean, I will say that, no, I haven't reasoned myself out of theism.
Well, get on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who Michael Hoover is. It's it's a little uncharitable to accuse Christians of just like rationalizing their Christianity just because they come away with the response that you don't like. Other than that, I don't really have much to say. I'm not really very familiar with this discussion.
Well, I had a small interaction with Michael. Seems like a nice guy. Seems like he meant the comment from a place of engaging with the podcast, and I took it as rather of a compliment that we weren't straw-manning any atheistic views in terms of really taking this to the point of looking at it. For me, a lot of the consideration after that podcast has been, I think it's less of a question of whether it's naturalism or a supernatural worldview that best equates with what we see in the research. I think it's actually more of a question of whether or not some form of determinism is true. So even if it came down to the fact that, okay, some form of determinism is true and we don't actually control our actions, then there is still Christian theology that would work with that view. Now, I don't necessarily think that it does. Joel's already answered the fact that that's not necessarily the case here, given rule-governed behavior. But it's more of a question of where your theology goes versus strictly going into naturalism. While naturalism has branches that are deterministic, it also has ones that aren't. So it's really more that determinism question than it is necessarily a question of atheism or theism.
All right. Well, we finished another podcast. Anybody not a Christian anymore? Have we talked anybody out?
No. I'm just curious if Caleb was determined to give that response, or if that was his own free will choice.
I don't know yet, but
how can we possibly know those things?
Right.
All right. Well, if you're an atheist and you also want us to talk ourselves out of our silly, backwards, Bronze Age religious beliefs, try and give us a 5-star review on your podcatcher. If we get a high enough review, maybe even Tyler will start listening to our show.
Doubtful, but he has made claims that he does so. And I just want to say, I want to thank Michael for his comment. I think it's great that he engaged with the material the way he did, and I'm really appreciative for that.
Yeah, and definitely want to say that I appreciate him listening to the podcast. So, yeah, you feel free to keep engaging.
Yeah,
keep engaging, and you'll keep getting shout-outs.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, there's like 50 of us vegetables, so you'll always get one person to talk to. All right. If you want to see what we're up to at any given time, consider following us on all of the everythings. We're on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube. We have an Instagram account, but I don't even know where it is or what it does, so not much use looking at us there. And as always, check out our website at thementionables.org.
Thementionables.org.
We are The Mentionables.